My name is Jim Boyce. I'm a fellow here at the Political Economy Research Institute, and it's a real pleasure to welcome our guests this evening. Robin Broad and John Cavanagh are co-authors of a book that's for sale in the back called The Water Defenders, which is about struggles of communities in El Salvador to defend their right to clean and safe water in the face of a threat from contamination by a foreign mining firm. I've known Robin and John for many, many years. We go back. Robin is a professor of international development at American University, has been a Guggenheim Fellow, and she and John are co-authors of this award-winning book, The Water Defenders. Prior to that, another of their books was called Plundering Paradise, The Struggle for the Environment in the Philippines, which is a great account of struggles over natural resources in that country during and in the period after the downfall of the Marcos dictatorship. John is the former director of the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington, D.C., an organization that many of you are familiar with. He directed it from '99 until last year, I think. Is that right? And now he's a senior advisor to the Institute, which is the kind of thing that happens to us all when we get to a certain age. If you're lucky, yeah. And he too has written many books on the global economy. And finally, Manuela Picq, who, if I'm not mistaken, is originally from Brazil, but now lives mostly in Quito in Ecuador, is a professor of international relations at the Universidad San Francisco de Quito, and also a senior lecturer here in Amherst College in political science. And she is co-founder of the movement of water defenders called Somos Agua, We Are Water, in Ecuador. We have, it turns out I discovered Manuela partly to thank for the fact that John and Robin are here, because in the small world way things go, they're old friends, and possibly even the most important motivation that brought John and Robin to the Valley was to visit Manuela. But in that case, we are enjoying an important side benefit. So I'm really glad that you could all be with us. The format tonight is each of them will speak for about 15 minutes. Then we'll open it up to Q&A. We also have an audience joining us remotely by Zoom. And so we're inviting them to ask questions as well. And the easiest way for them to do that will be to submit the questions in the chat box on Zoom, and then they will be relayed to us by our computer guru here. So thank you again for coming. We're here till 6:30. Let me remind you again, books, The Water Defender, are for sale. There are also a couple free publications from a project called the Natural Assets Project that I organized a number of years ago that is kind of consistent with the theme of today's event, since much of it revolves around the notion that the right to a clean and safe environment is really a basic human right that we all should defend and should be available to everyone, rather than a commodity that should be allocated on the basis of purchasing power, or a privilege that should be allocated on the basis of political power. So feel free to pick those freebies up on your way out if you like. So without further ado, let me hand it over to you, Robin.
Do I need to move? That works? Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you all this afternoon, this evening, whatever we call this time of day at this time of year. A special shout out, Jerry, where are you? A special shout out to Jerry in the back, to Manuela over here, to Jim Boyce, to Nicole Dunham, to Tom selling the books, to the computer guru whose name we don't know, so we'll just call him Guru. So Manuela isn't our, is that echoing? Or it's just for me? Manuela isn't our only, do I need that?
You do for
For the recording.
video, yeah.
I just wasted a minute of my time asking that. Manuela isn't the only, we no longer call them old friends, but friends from the past who brought us here. I think the first person, we met Jerry when he was much older than we were. He was a year or two ahead of us in graduate school, and he was one of those much adored and much, much adored, revered econ TAs, who, if you were nice to him, told you the answers to what was going to come up on your quiz the next day. Jim and his partner Betsy, well, I don't actually know when we met Jim. Our paths have crossed, his in the Philippines, I think in Costa Rica and elsewhere. And Manuela and I crisscrossed the world of scholar activism and this watching and being a part of what we sometimes call the green tide. And now we're calling it the blue tide, except we have to be careful calling it the blue tide, given events in the US recently. In any case, you all and lots of other friends in the audience, we have great appreciation for the work that's done at Perry and for all of your work and commitment to making the world a better place. And we couldn't be, it's wonderful. So there's a rule when you give talks, if your audience is more than 10 people, you're a huge success. So any of you who brought the number over 10, thank you. As John and I planned for today, we decided that the best way to introduce our book and, our book, this is our book in Spanish. Most of you are not going to read it in Spanish, but isn't that I don't know if you can see the cover. That's covered by a Mexican artist. It's really an incredible cover. Forget the insides, but anyways, we decided that the best way to introduce our book and these issues was to get you into the story in much the same way we got into it in 2009, and then to pull out some of the major lessons and themes that we found in the context of what, as I told you, we and Manuela see as a rising blue/green tide in Latin America and elsewhere. And of course, leaving time for you to listen to the amazing Manuela Picq, and then to dive into Jim's and anyone else's comments and questions. So to begin, as we began in 2009, I'm going to read you about 10 minutes of excerpts from The Water Defenders. For nearly 2 weeks, Marcelo Rivera's family could not find him. Then on June 29th, 2009, they received the brief phone call they had been dreading. The anonymous scholar was brief. There was a body in an old abandoned well just west of the Rivera hometown of San Isidro Cabañas. The well was near the spot where Marcelo had last been seen some 12 days earlier, getting off the bus at a turnoff to the capital city. During those 12 days, Marcelo's family and friends had been at wit's end, searching frantically, desperately for him. They had spread the news of his disappearance to all the barrios of San Isidro and nearby towns. They had called the police for over a week to no avail. The Rivera family had even filed a formal complaint with the country's attorney general, pleading with him to conduct an investigation into Marcelo's disappearance. But another poor person gone missing up in the rural north meant little to the authorities. After the anonymous call to Marcelo's family, the police finally acted. They pulled the remains of a body out of the dry 30-meter deep well. So extensive was the torture that the body was unrecognizable. The face was grotesquely disfigured. No jaw, no lips, no nose. The fingernails had been ripped off. The testicles bound. The trachea had been broken with a nylon cord. In the assessment of the coroner, the death had been caused by asphyxiation. The public prosecutor disagreed, concluding that the death had come from blows to the head by a hammer. Whatever the cause of his death, Marcelo Rivera became the first of several water defenders to be assassinated in the 21st century fight over mining in El Salvador. Though John and I never met Marcelo, we have been haunted by him and the circumstances of his death ever since. Who killed Marcelo and why? Perhaps you know the difference between a tortilla and a pupusa, or perhaps, like us, you are entering the story without a clue. Perhaps El Salvador is not even on your radar screen, or perhaps El Salvador is on your radar screen only because of gangs or immigrants who trek north. But really, that doesn't matter. Certainly, on one level, this is a story about El Salvador. At the same time, it is not just about El Salvador. This is a David versus Goliath story about a battle between a country and a foreign mining company. But it is also about how global corporations, be they big gold or big pharma or big tobacco or big oil or big banks, move into poorer communities in countries all over the world. Marcelo's story, before and after his murder, is about the struggle for clean and affordable water everywhere. It is also a story about how workers and communities defending their air and land, their health and their climate, and their rights to defend themselves against corporate incursion, about how to prioritize those rights and the common good versus the usual prioritization of profits of big corporations and their owners. It is certainly a story about gold and when and why we should leave it in the ground. But it is also about coal or natural gas or fossil fuels. It is also about whether we measure progress in aggregate financial terms or through the well-being of people and the planet, and about who gets to make the decisions that affect our lives and that affect their lives. To say this story of the water defenders versus big gold holds keys to reversing the outsized power of global corporations today is not an exaggeration. You may find yourself surprised by the relevance of the strategies of the water defenders in El Salvador, whether your focus is on a Walmart in Washington, D.C., or somewhere nearby in Massachusetts, a fracking company trying to expand in Texas or Pennsylvania, or petrochemical companies outside New Orleans. Along the way, however cliched the quote attributed to Margaret Mead may have become, you may also find yourself inspired by a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens who stand up to corporate power. We first heard of Marcelo in May 2009, just a month before his murder. He was a 37-year-old teacher who directed his hometown's cultural center, an avid reader, a person who loved theater and the arts, and a good practical joke. We heard his name because he was the leader of the main coalition of Salvadorans opposed to mining, the National Roundtable on Mining in El Salvador, or La Mesa. The Roundtable was not at all well known outside of El Salvador, but we learned of it because the group had been chosen to receive a prestigious human rights award from the Institute for Policy Studies, where John works. In 2009, the Institute selected the Roundtable to honor the Roundtable's opposition to mining companies eager to exploit the gold deposits near El Salvador's major river. On a misty night in October 2009, just months after Marcelo's body was pulled from that well, hundreds gathered at the National Press Club in downtown DC to meet and applaud the Salvadoran water defenders. Among them was Marcelo's youngest brother and best friend, Miguel. Miguel had come in his brother's place. Grief marked his face. Accepting the award on behalf of Miguel and 3 other La Mesa leaders was a peasant and a community leader from the heart of gold country, Vidalina Morales. Vidalina looked small behind the podium. She at first appeared hesitant, nervous before the large audience, fragile even. Then she began to speak. Her words filled the auditorium almost as though she did not need the microphone. For nearly 20 minutes, Vidalina held the crowd spellbound as she relayed the saga of El Salvador's water defenders standing up to big gold. The Lempa River, she explained, winds through the country like a snake, providing water for over half the population. Water for drinking, water for farming, water for fishing, water for the cities as well as the rural population. But the project of the Canadian headquartered Pacific Rim Mining Corporation at its proposed El Dorado site in Miguel and Marcelo's hometown posed serious threats to the Lempa River. Key among those threats was the toxic cyanide that Pac Rim would use to separate the gold from the rock. Vidalina ended her acceptance speech with a seemingly audacious demand that the government of El Salvador stand up to global mining companies and choose water over gold by banning the mining of all metals. All metals. Before this, Vidalina had urged the audience to follow a related legal thriller unfolding 4 blocks to the west of where we sat, at a little-known tribunal in Washington, D.C., at the World Bank Group. There, as Vidalina explained, Pac Rim had filed a lawsuit against the government of El Salvador right before Marcelo's murder. Pac Rim claimed that El Salvador either had to allow the company to mine or pay the company over $300 million in costs and foregone profits from future mining. Vidalina invoked the upside-down world summoned by Uruguayan writer Eduardo Galeano in asking why it was not El Salvador suing Pac Rim, since the mining company threatened the water and well-being of her country. But that upside-down world is the reality of global corporate power and economic rules that affect people around the globe. And as we too think back to that evening, we must admit that we each silently and separately, that is without telling each other, found it just as far-fetched to imagine a national legislature passing a law to end mining as it was to conceive of this World Bank tribunal siding with Vidalina and the rest of the water defenders. At the reception following the award ceremony, we huddled with Marcelo's brother, Miguel. Miguel was soft-spoken and gentle in his manner, understandably a bit shy as he asked us for help. After all, we had just met. He seemed both incredibly focused on the details of what had to happen next and incredibly shell-shocked by the chain of events, by his brother's murder and by the lawsuit. But his appeal was urgent, direct, and heartfelt. We don't know this tribunal or how it works. We don't know what to expect. Can you help us find out about this lawsuit? On that misty evening in October 2009, who could have guessed that Miguel's questions and Vidalina's call to action would pull us two and thousands of others around the globe into the vortex of 3 interrelated unknowns for nearly a decade to come. First, there was the on-the-ground mystery. Who killed Marcelo Rivera and why? Not just who carried out the brutal murder, but who was the mastermind? Secondly, there was the mystery at the national level. Could El Salvador possibly become the first nation on earth to ban mining, or at least move closer to that direction? Or did all this hoopla about stopping mining simply mean, as most people watching this assumed in 2009, that Pac Rim had not paid a high enough bribe to top Salvadoran officials? And finally, the global legal thriller. Could small El Salvador possibly prevail against the global mining industry in Washington, D.C.? Would El Salvador, an economically poorer country, even have enough money to pay for its legal and related costs, enough money to hire a lawyer savvy enough to take on what would undoubtedly be a top corporate law team hired by Pac-Rim. We had absolutely no idea how these mysteries would play out. But as we joined the hundreds of people who streamed out of the National Press Club after the award company, we knew that we were hooked. We knew we needed to find out more about this tribunal, at least a day or two, to try to answer Miguel's questions. So now I'm going to turn this over to John, who's going to share some more of our reflections and segue into the blue tide, which then Manuela is going to take from there. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Robin, and wonderful to be here with all of you. My Institute for Policy Studies has an anchor here in Western Massachusetts. We have our National Priorities Project here. We have Foreign Policy in Focus, which is headed up by John Pfeffer. So IPS is here in the room, and it's great to see you all. We've worked with Perry for decades, it's just a pleasure to be here with all of you. I'm going to say just a little bit more about, you're now on the edge of your seat about what happens, and then segue into this broader, what we think is a very hopeful period in Latin America. So first, just to end the suspense, yes, in March 2017, El Salvador became the first country in the world to ban all metals mining to save its rivers. And 6 months earlier, in a unanimous decision, this corporate bias tribunal in Washington, D.C. ruled against the mining company and in favor of El Salvador. So what can we learn from this? One quick word of background on the relationship between gold mining and water, because it's not a pleasant relationship. Some of you know mining, but gold mining requires a huge amount of water. Industrial mines use cyanide, a toxic chemical, to separate the gold from the rock, which invariably escapes into the surrounding land and water. And in about half of the gold mines in the world, there's sulfides in the soil. So when you crack open the rock, you expose the sulfides to the air and water, and it turns into sulfuric acid. And for centuries afterwards, whenever it rains, the sulfuric acid leaches out toxic minerals, arsenic, iron, and other things into the surrounding soil. So it's very hard to do mining in a safe way. Just some three quick lessons from this that we think are relevant to fights everywhere and to this moment in the United States. How did they win? One, fantastic organizing on the ground, grassroots organizing, and organizing that was educated organizing. The people at the core of this story that Robin just told you studied the science of mining, they studied hydrology, and then they used every possible means to educate the public, to the point where 3 years after they started, a poll showed that 2/3 of Salvadorans were against mining. So fantastic organizing on the ground, first locally, then nationally, and then they organized us globally. And some of you got involved in that. Secondly, and maybe this sounds obvious, but their message, they came together around a message that would unite just about anyone. They did not focus on the fact they were anti-mining. They focused on the fact that they were for water. Their main slogan was "Water is life. We can live without gold, but we can't live without water." And then finally, the third thing, very relevant for the United States today, they looked at the political scene in El Salvador and said, what's it going to take to win in a country where 2/3 of the national legislature were two different right-wing parties? And the Progressive Party, the FMLN, was itself divided on mining. It was listening a lot to left parties in the rest of Latin America and Bolivia, Peru, Ecuador, Venezuela, who said mine and use the proceeds to help fight inequality, to help the poor. So the leading left party is split, and then you've got two pro-business parties. So how do you win in that situation? And they did the obvious thing that we all do. They organized the likely allies, and in this case, the religious community environmentalists, women's groups, youth groups, and they turned to groups like IPS to help organize those globally. But that would win them, maybe a sixth of the votes they needed. So they then, in what we think of as creative audacity, reached out to a set of unlikely allies. El Salvador, many of you, the one name you know is Archbishop, now Saint Oscar Romero. After he was killed, the Vatican got smart and started putting in a slew of very conservative archbishops. So the church seemed an unlikely place, but a key target. And they went in. They tried for months to get a meeting. They finally get a meeting. It's going nowhere. You've all been in meetings that are going nowhere with the Archbishop. And then they mentioned cyanide, and he lit up. And turns out he had a degree in chemistry. He knew the dangers of cyanide. He shifted the Catholic Church towards the water defenders and used the pulpits to help win other people. And there are a lot of other amazing figures. They turned to a former minister of the Death Squad party, environment minister who cared about the law and who became an ally, a leader of ARENA in the Environment Committee who's had come to school in the United States and learned about the environment. It's the Mitch McConnell, if you will. They reached out to the Mitch McConnell of El Salvador and won him over. So just huge lessons from that. They won unanimously. By the end, every member of Congress voted for the mining ban. Okay, so let me just say a few words on now the topic of, is El Salvador an outlier or other things going on in Latin America that merit our attention and that give us hope for a different kind of future? And is there a blue meaning water in this case, blue tide or green tide rising in Latin America? So I'm going to do a little quiz here. So imagine a president who promises to turn his country into a global powerhouse of life. Somebody just said this. So 4 new presidents have been elected in the last year, running on environmental platforms, among other things. Who do you think is the global powerhouse of life? Which of them? Any guesses? Sorry? Petro. Okay, so we've got Gustavo Petro, the new president of Colombia, elected with the first Afro-Colombian and Vice President Francia Marquez is elected, and he's ran on banning fracking, no new oil exploration, and investing heavily in solar and wind, among other things. Imagine a president who pledges to fight for zero deforestation. Who do you think that is? Lula, who right now is where? He's not in Brazil, he's in Egypt at the climate talks. His predecessor, Bolsonaro, alienated everybody, cut off all funding. He's there to try to open up new funds for saving the Amazon. Imagine a president who ran on turning his country into a, quote, graveyard of neoliberalism. Who do you think that was? That's a Perry. That should be the Perry candidate right there. Yeah, sorry. Boric in Chile. So Gabriel Boric. The thing that those 3 individuals, by the way, have in common with the water defenders is they also won the Institute for Policy Studies Letelier Moffitt Human Rights Awards in 2003, 2007, and 2012. So we have a good record. If you want to become a president in Latin America, come to us. Come back off the selection committee. No, now, so that's interesting about those 3. The woman who came to accept the Chilean, so the awards go to movements that these people were part of, but the woman who accepted it for the Chilean student movement was this amazing student leader who some of you remember, Camila Vallejo, who's now the spokesperson for the government of Boric, but not the president. There you go. The 4th one I was going to mention. So who's the 4th president elected in Latin America in the last year on a platform that included a strong plank on the environment? Who is a woman? Anybody remember that? It was exactly 1 year ago. She's elected president of a country run by narco-fascists. Xiomara Castro, okay, Honduras. And she ran, and immediately upon her being elected, she called for a ban on all new open pit mining in a country that basically had been taken over by mining companies. So that's why we're thinking we're maybe at the beginning of a blue wave. Now, all of these people are elected out of strong social movements, pushing them into power. So I just want to end with a few questions that Manuela will then reflect on as well, which is first is, can we call it a blue tide? If I just mentioned 4 countries, they joined, by the way, in Latin America, a country that Jim and others know well, Costa Rica, is a country that organized its economy around preservation of the environment and advancing environmental goals. So they aren't the only 4. There's hints of it elsewhere. But can we call it a blue tide if the other, we just looked at a fun list, there's 14 countries in Latin America that have over 10 million people. Today, 10 of the 14 are run by center-left governments, or left governments in the case of Cuba and Venezuela. So 10 out of 14 are center-left. But the other, so I mentioned, 4 at the beginning. The other 6 are not so good on the environment. Led by the number 2 country, Mexico, is run by an interesting center-left guy, but who's an oil man, who loves oil. AMLO. Same with the 4th largest country, Argentina. The president is not yet a country with dynamic social movements fighting. 7 of the 21 provinces in Argentina have banned mining because it's close to glaciers for other reasons. But Peru, Bolivia, Cuba, and Venezuela would be the other 6. And none of those governments are distinguished by their environmental record. So can we call it a blue tide in that situation? But I did mention it's the 4 most recently elected. Second, what are the constraints on these governments, given that many of you who know Latin America know they do their elections in a fascinating way. They have a first round with lots of candidates, then the top 2 go on to a second round. All of these 4 ran on those platforms. Then in the last 3 to 4 weeks, they have to form broad coalitions to win, coalitions with much more centrist forces. So there is a constraint, a political constraint on these governments. And finally, third, I just would ask the question, can you call it a blue tide or a green tide? Not just looking at governments, but looking at social movements as well. And is there an upsurge in pro-water, pro-indigenous, pro-women, pro-LGBTQ movements in this part of the world? The short answer is yes, but you'll hear more about that from the wonderful Manuela Picq. So over to Manuela.
Okay, am I okay here? Do I have to go there? Okay. So it's a pleasure to be here. I'll reiterate, but I want to say to the audience that these 2 people are really enablers of water defenders in Latin America, maybe the world, but I'm speaking for Latin America. And that if Yaku goes anywhere, it's going to be in part thanks to you. So thank you for enabling the struggles. It's really hard on the ground. I'm going to start with the pessimism before we go to the positive. Marcelo Rivera is one of many water defenders who were killed. It's much more dangerous to defend nature than to be a journalist in areas of war, for instance, right? There's an average of a nature defender killed every 30 hours in official conservative numbers in the world. Almost half of them, about 45% of them, are indigenous peoples. So I'm saying some numbers just to keep our attention on who the water defenders actually are. Water defenders are indigenous peoples, almost half of them, but indigenous peoples are only 5% of the world population. So they shouldn't be almost half of the nature defenders killed. Indigenous peoples are 5% of the world population, and they have 80% of the remaining world biodiversity on their territories. That's UN numbers. UN is not exactly a radical institution, so we can agree that those are conservative numbers. So I give this as an opening Because when we're talking about water defenders, we're talking about indigenous and local communities who are protecting territory, right? So you posed the question of how do we assess progress, right? Both of you, I would say, how do we call this civilizatory crisis? Do we call it the Anthropocene? Do we call it a climate crisis? Do we call it dispossession, despojo, destierro? Are we talking about conservation and mass extinction and the 30-30 and 50-50 plan? I don't know if anybody knows what that is, but they want to preserve, the global north conservationists want to preserve 50% of the world by 2050. Guess which territories are going to be protected? Not Amherst. So all of these narratives of conservation erase people like Marcelo Rivera and what they go through on a daily basis, right, to protect their territory. So in the global south, usually we call it self-determination, not conservation. It's about prior consultation. It's about self-determination. It's about consent. So the thing that I'm thinking a lot about lately is these ontologies of consent. It's not about biodiversity, it's about consent, right? Even the UN recognizes that the Amazon is a social legacy from thousands of years of indigenous people shaping biodiversity and humans being co-constitutive of the biodiversity that exists in the Amazon today. So it's not about protecting the environment, it's about protecting a certain relationship between people and the environment that can exist, right? Not all humans are creating the Anthropocene. So to go to today, on the ground, it looks very much like the water defenders in El Salvador. It looks the same in Colombia, in Ecuador. Were you studying cobalt in the Congo? Everywhere in the world, in the Philippines, of course, in Mindanao. A lot of these people, they get framed as terrorists, accused of sabotage and terrorism by the state, right? Framed as drug dealers, right? In Duterte's government, it's going that way too. And what we are focusing on to protect water and nature is not the rights of nature, because this is something that gets appropriated by conservative narratives in the global north, but that are not really protecting territory. Right? We're focusing on consultation and consent, prior consultation and consent. And it's endless. Like some people in the room who know me know that we go from one struggle to the other and we think we're going to just have a normal week and be able to teach. And then we spend all of our time doing activism and going to court and trying to sue the government, to stop the government from stealing territory, from killing people, from jailing. So we have one of the struggles we're involved in Ecuador, there's the rights of nature. Beautiful narrative, right? Looks like a green tide from the outside. But then since we have it was the first country in the world to institutionalize the rights of nature in the Constitution in 2008. So it's a great legal framework, right? Decolonial. But then on the ground, we actually have much more destruction of territory, dispossession, criminalization of nature defendants since having the rights of nature, because it's almost a performance of conservation, nature, and green tide. And then it allows you to further criminalize people defending territory, right? So criminalization of indigenous and just local community nature defenders through the roof. There are big projects, many of them green projects like hydro dams, right? That generate energy for the mining companies, because for the mining corporation to come to get lithium or cobalt or silver or gold, they need a lot of electricity. So first they come, they dam your rivers, so the communities already know if the hydro dam is coming, next the mining corporation is coming, right? And so it's a way of non-stop fight for rights to prior consultation. The only thing that's really working are rights to prior consultation. The big projects that were stopped. So one example is the Rio Blanco mine, which is a Chinese corporation, right, that was granted a concession in the highlands of southern Ecuador. The local communities were able to stop them, Yaku being involved as the lawyer. Many of them were killed. They killed a pregnant woman 2 weeks ago on that territory. Yaku almost died too on that one. They were able to stop that mine, which was already operationalized, that was already extracting, they had already $50 million invested because of lack of consultation, right? So the judge said, you didn't consult, that's why we're stopping the mine. Of course, there's a lot of, I'm not going to get into the details, but they're like local conjunctures in local politics that allow or not judges to make this kind of decisions, right? Because it's not just about the law, it's the political frame that may be too dangerous or not to stop a project like that. But it's prior consultation time and again that was used to stop these big projects. So what's the latest? So we have one case, it's Kimsakocha, that we're trying to block the people voted, like there are many. I'm going to talk a little bit about the politics that are blue tiding. But despite many prior sentences and legal votes against mining, the government still went forward, sold the mountains of Kimsakocha to corporations, and then we're in court against them. We won at the first instance by lack of prior consultation, and we're awaiting for a sentence on the last instance in the province of Azuay. In the courtroom, it was 2-3 weeks ago, in the courtroom, the lawyers of the corporation, which are the lawyers of the states, the states, the Ministry of the Environment, the Ministry of Indigenous Peoples, the Ministry of Mine, the Ministry of Renewable Energy, the Office of the President, the Ministry of Development, all of these were, their lawyers were there with the mine corporation against indigenous communities, right? So we have one lawyer, Yaku, working for free for the indigenous communities, the peasants, right? Most of them who never went to school, the indigenous local communities, facing this army of lawyers and state institutions to justify the appropriation of their territories for development. And one of the arguments that they said in court was, there are indigenous peoples, but there are no indigenous communities there. And we're like, what are they saying, right? Like they're trying to get out political rights away from us. And the Minister of the Environment said, it's not because they speak Quechua that they have Quechua names and that they dress Quechua, like with traditional outfits, that they're indigenous. And we're like, so I put a post on Twitter, just like out of the rage, saying this is definitional violence. We know that in the North, the Bureau of Indian Affairs does exactly that, writing tribes out of existence when they need the territories, right, for extraction. And then the former president of the census, of the Institute for Census of Population of Ecuador, sends me a tweet in private saying, I need to talk to you. This is happening right now in the new census, right? So we get out of the Kimsakocha, and here we're again going to court because it turns out the new census is shifting the categories. They disappeared 3 indigenous peoples, 2 nations and 1 community, actually 4. And they are creating a census, a registry of communities without informing anybody, which means people don't really know, so they won't be able to go register. And then they're going to say, oh, here there's no indigenous communities, so you don't have rights to prior consultation. So yes, the rights of nature will go forward, but who protects the rights of nature? The river is not going to come to courts, right? Nature depends on communities advocating for its rights in courts. And the governments are now saying, yes, consulta, let's do a consultation, let's make a law on consultation. So that happened. The census is designed, so we start digging into it. Who's financing the census in Ecuador? Yes. The World Bank. Duh. The World Bank has given $80 million. The prior president of the INEC, which is the Institute for the Census, the former president is like, why are they getting a loan of $80 million? We don't need a loan. Like, there was no need for a loan. On top of that, it turns out this census is costing 3 times more than any other census in Latin America going on, including Brazil by the IBGE, and Brazil is the most expensive place to do a census. Where's the money going? Right. So you start seeing how corporations are going through the World Bank to reshape categories of who is indigenous, who has prior rights to prior consultation. They're playing the long game because they're buying now the territories. They can wait 5 years. The price of gold is going to go up. The price of lithium is going to go up. The price of cobalt is going to go up because there's this green transition going on fostered by the North. That's probably going to be one of the results from Egypt, right? So I'm giving you that as a background. On the ground, we only see things getting worse. And we urgently need to coordinate our narratives from the global north to the global south, because we can't keep talking about the Anthropocene and the climate crisis and the green transition or whatever else without talking about indigenous people, nature defenders, and rights to prior consultation. It feels just like terra nullius all over again, time and again. The doctrine of discovery feels like it never ends. So on the good side, there might be a blue tide. So last year I was a little more optimistic, but it is happening. So what we experienced last year in election, and I see that on the election front, right? So this creative audacity you were talking about gives me hope. And thank you for refreshing my memory about the good sides of things happening. So in Ecuador, we had my partner, Yaku Perez, who's a water defender. So he's an indigenous water defender. He's been defending water in his territory for 30 years and in Ecuador for 20 years. He ran through the indigenous party, Pachakutik, and nobody paid attention because he was a nobody. We didn't have any money. We literally did the campaign with $400,000, less than $500,000. And we got over 20% of the vote. The president who won, who was a banker, spent $45 million in his campaign, just to give you a sense, right? Yaku ran on a platform, Somos Agua, we are water. No extractivism, let's block the extractive frontier, right? Let's try to reinvent the economy. He didn't win, but he got 20% of the vote. And one of the things that did win in Ecuador in that election was that Cuenca, the third largest city, was able to get a local consultation about water, whether there would be mining in the mountains or not. And 80% of people voted against mining to preserve water in the highlands. This means that local people, city people, are aware of water and are starting to defend it and are able to dissociate it from those narratives of development. So that's really good. They still sold the mountains even though it's illegal. So that's another one. That happened in Ecuador. In Chile, for 2 months later, so that was in February, in April, in Greenland, the Atakatigit party won. Greenland is still a colony, but it has an autonomous parliament. And in its parliament, it had an Inuit indigenous party, but that was pro-extractivism that was in there for a long time and was allowing for a uranium mine huge in the south of Greenland to go forward. A nobody little party, Inuit indigenous, but anti-extractivist, won in the elections, 37%, made one alliance with a center-right party, had a majority in Congress, in Parliament, and was able to stop immediate mining ban and stop the uranium mine. So that's a really good and interesting move because it's indigenous party against indigenous party, but one is extractivist and the other is anti-extractivist. And the anti-extractivist won, like by a lot, out of the blue. And then 2 months later, I think in June or July, in Chile, there were elections, Boric, etc. But the local election, because Boric is not an anti-extractivist, like he goes with the flow, but he's a student leader, right? He's a leftist, but he's not a water defender. I'm talking specifically about water defenders. And Valparaíso, which is one of the provinces, it's the big port of Chile, and it's one of the provinces with most extraction. The avocados you eat, they come from Valparaíso, a lot of them. And avocados are a big problem because it generates a lot of water scarcity. Don't eat avocados. Rodrigo Mundaca had been for 40 years defending water rights and fighting agribusiness. He's from Modatima, which is a movement for the defense of the land and water. He won as governor, and 3 or 4 people from Modatima, from this grassroots movement, won to Congress and were actually in the Constitutional Assembly too, many of them young women. And so those are some examples. Then, you know, there's Petro. Petro himself is not but Francia Marquez is, and it's amazing that she was in there, and she got him elected. So we have hope. So there are some real water defenders whose agenda is not the left, liberalism, human rights, it's water, nature, territories, and prior constitution. And they're getting into government. We're hoping that's a blue tide in the Latin American sense, not in the US sense. I had never thought about that either. I don't know where else it's happening, but if it happens, it's going to happen from the bottom up, and we should be investing effort, energy, and space in amplifying the voice of local activists to enter politics. Thank you.
Thank you.
Let's go into
Well, thank you very much. And we now have about half an hour, a little more, in fact, for any questions and discussion. Let me just lead off by saying that for those of you who don't know El Salvador, which I assume is most of you, the area where the struggle that Robin and John described has taken place, a district called Cabanagh in the north on the Honduran border, is a very poor district in what's a poor country. And it's also a district that has a long, long history of struggles and violence. My partner Betsy and I visited a friend up there in 1993, right after the war had stopped, after the peace accords had been signed, in a village called Santa Marta. It became a famous village because it's a village where the people had been driven out during the war and had fled across the Rio Lempa to the Honduran border. And as they were swimming and trying to cross the river, they were machine gunned from US supplied helicopters with US supplied bullets. And the river just ran red with blood. It's a story of a massacre that ultimately was revealed later in the New York Times. And during the war, that part of El Salvador actually was taken over by the guerrillas, the FMLN, and the people from Honduras, from the refugee camps, came back across the river and repopulated the village and much of the district. And this is the place where, 1992 to 2009, not even 20 years later, this new wave of struggles and violence has been taking place. So these things don't emerge in a vacuum, and the ability of people to organize, to fight, to protect their lands and their water, builds on a long history of sacrifice. So anyway, it just sure, yeah, of course.
There you go.
I go. So actually, Vidalina Morales is from Santa Marta.
Okay,
So you may well have met her with.
she would have been a little kid, but
She
yeah,
would have been a little kid, but
yeah,
as you said, so this is an area where the population of northern Cabanagh was pushed over the river into Honduras and eventually came back into really, I guess, into areas that the government of El Salvador provided no services for because they were known as being on the left.
that's right.
And when we the first time we visited Santa Marta, or one of the first times, we sat down and, like in many of our visits, we sat down and prepared ourselves for long stories being told. And a man who was somewhat older than we were, told us the story of crossing the river. And he said he had twin newborn daughters in his arms, and one of them drowned as they were crossing the river. And then the Honduran military, so on one hand, the US Salvadoran military was pushing them over. And on the other hand, the Honduran military was meeting them and telling them not to come. A Honduran military, I got goosebumps. So stopped the man and his surviving twin. And for some reason that he has no idea why, let them cross. And so John and I are, of course, sitting there shell-shocked as we listen to the story. And then Don Carlos and Vidalina, we start, talking about what, oh, how it's horrible. And then they say, but, we wouldn't have been able to do the organizing we did today if we hadn't gone through that experience. So that's, I don't like the word resilience, but it says something about that. The other thing to say is that we didn't mention, because we had a very good timekeeper, but it's a really poor province. And so when the mining companies first started coming in, people, including Vidalina, not Marcelo, but the majority of people were really excited about the thought of having jobs. So these people, as John mentioned, came to be against mining because they learned about what it would mean for their land, which was even more important for them because they had fought so hard for it and lost it during the war.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
thank
Yeah.
you for adding that. I
Sure.
didn't know you had gone to Santa Marta.
All right, enough reminiscing. Any questions? We'll start with the audience here and then we'll alternate back and forth the Zoom audience if we've got some questions coming in the chat. Let me remind the Zoom listeners, if you've got a question, please send it to the chat.
So I would like to,
Excuse me, can you introduce yourself?
my name is Andy Zimbalist. I'd like to pick up on something Robin just said. Well, first of all, I've read The Water Defenders. If anybody here hasn't read it, you should read it. It's an amazing story. It's really inspiring. I think one of the major tasks that confront us is how to bring that to scale so that it's not simply micro communities that are defending their way of life and defending water, but so that it could be national movements and international movements. And so my concern is the process by which we could bring these micro movements to scale and begin to dominate national politics or regional politics in some cases. And it strikes me, and this is going to what Robin was just talking about, it strikes me that there needs to be a complement to being anti-extractivist, and the complement needs to be pro what? How are we going to build the local economy so that people can have jobs? And I think that that's going to make it much more easier for some of these movements to become larger scale and successful. So that's my question. What has been thought about in terms of the pro side of this? What kinds of transformations are possible that would provide successful employment?
Do you want to take several questions or do you want?
What would you prefer? Want to take several? Okay, I don't have a piece of paper, so one of you
We'll remember, yeah.
keep track. Is there a question from nothing from the Zoom folks yet? So anyone else from the audience?
Hi everyone, I'm Debamanu Das. I am a PhD student in this department, Department of Economics. Thank you for the fascinating talk. I have two questions particularly. One is thinking of the blue tide, which you mentioned. So whenever this type of a movement is happening, if we think in terms of capitalism or in terms of pro-business or in terms of an economy which is dominated by business motives or profit motives, there need to be a shift of profit from one sector to another. So what I'm thinking is that if the mining sector is not the primary sector right now, where is it shifted towards? What are the employment impacts of this particular shift with respect to the blue tide? And the second part is with respect to the green transition, which is something which I'm working on right now for my own dissertation. It seems that for countries like Chile or Bolivia or Argentina, which is actually termed as the lithium triangle, these critical mineral mining is happening at a faster pace than it has had in the recent past. So with respect to all these critical mineral mining, would you like to reconsider your statement about blue tide, which is happening? Yeah, that's all. Thank you.
Leon?
I haven't read the book and I promise I'll read it. Thank you very much. Excellent presentation. Just some quick reaction without having read the book. You mentioned that the defenders of water are mostly indigenous people, and indigenous people are a small minority of the population. What does it tell us?
Can you repeat that?
Yeah, what does it tell us that the majority of the water defenders are the minority of the population? Yeah. The second is, I I think it was, I don't know who said that, it kind of distinguished between defending the water and fighting against mining. To me, it's a very important distinction, whether the issue is that mining is polluting water, or is it the issue that there is mining? Okay. And that links to the issue that the moment is asking about the transition. So if I'm the people of Zambia that have huge reserves of copper, what's the proposition? Is it that we stop mining copper and do something else? I don't know what that's something else. Or that we find a technology that produces copper without polluting the water. So what should be the fight? Is it about not mining, or is mining cleanly? If it is not mining, then I want to ask this question: what is the substitute? Because that's a resource that this country has. I was looking at the list of the top producers of oil, because that's when you look at the discussion about transition, the smokestack industries, stopping them. The key ones are the hydro, carbo, oil and gas and all that. So, and there are arguments that these resources should stay in the ground. It's called the stranding, or should degrowth. I was looking at the list of countries that based on oil production quantity. Who's the top one? What's the top producer of oil? The US. And what's the second? Russia. The third? Saudi Arabia. And far back, Canada. So at the same time, there is a talk about encouraging countries not to invest anything in oil, no new investment in oil. But at the same time, the countries that have the biggest capital, the most developed, that don't actually need less to create employment and all that, are the top producers of oil. Which world are we in? I'll stop here. Then I'll ask more questions when I finish reading the book.
Well, that seems like a pretty good set to begin with. I'll let you decide amongst yourselves how to parcel it out.
It is your job, right, here at Perry to figure out the solution. And we hope you're going to train the PhD students to figure that out, the substitute. The fact that indigenous communities are the minority and are the ones fighting, it's because it's on their territories. It's the same in the US, which territories are terra nullius, which lands are framed as wastelands, which bodies are framed as wastelands. Pollution is colonialism, right? It's a great book you should look into. Thank you, Kieran, for the suggestion. It's about because mining pollutes the water. It pollutes the water, it grabs the water because it redirects it, so it dries up areas, and the areas with water, it's polluted water, and it land grabs, right? So it's a multiplicity of factors. Mining creates man camps. Man camps increase alcoholism, sexual violence, it brings AIDS, the list goes on, teenage pregnancies, et cetera, So it's the whole package that people are fighting, but water is the first thing. Water pollution and water grab. Clean mining does not exist. It's a myth. So that's part of the strategy of the corporation, is to claim green mining and sustainable mining. It doesn't exist, right? So I think I'm going to pass it on, but one of the the role, I think, in the North is to reconceptualize the frames of the debate, to go back maybe to transition to Andy's question, which you already asked Yakos, what's the solution and how do people make money? Well, maybe it's not about making money. Maybe it's not about profit. Maybe it's about shifting away from profit. People in these territories have lived forever without these problems. Why do they need to have dollars, right? They have lived selling food, selling grains, selling other things. And in Ecuador, for instance, mining accounts for 2.3% of the GDP, tourism 5%. Let's go to green tourism. Like, why do we need to go into mining? And if it were absolutely necessary, we don't mine in water sources up in the mountains, right? So then at least we can regulate where mining is done so that we don't lose forever in irreversible way through ecocide, the life ways, like the systems, the nature that gives us life. But just as a number again, in Chile, electricity, only 16% of electricity is for individual consumption. The rest is for industry. So it's we're creating energy for industrial energy, and it's the machine eating itself, but eating everything around with it.
That's great. Yeah.
So I'm going to try and answer a couple. I'll shuffle some of them together, and then John will deal with whatever remains. So for some of it, we really have to shift our framework and shift our perspective and not and move to thinking like people on the ground, like the frontline defenders, think about their territories and their well-being and their future and their children's future and their children's future. And you, as some of you know, they think 4 generations ahead. We can't think to next week, but they think 4 generations ahead. And so a couple of things I want to say. First of all, it is really important to focus on indigenous people and indigenous communities because they are the guardians of our future. But we also can't think only about them because in the kind of organizing that Manuela is talking about and we're talking about, the organizing that they are doing, it's concentric circles. It spreads out from them. So it starts with the minority of the population, but it moves to majority precisely because the challenges, the problems are reframed to be not just about short-term jobs, and not just about the rights of nature, but and so we actually can't really separate fighting mining from defending water because they're against mining, not because they're against mining. Well, actually, let me take it back. The people in San Isidro, if you were to propose an open pit mine in the municipality of San Isidro, El Salvador, even without it affecting mining, they would not be in favor of it because it's their land. It's their territory. Actually, they're indigenous people. They're part of the Lenca tribe, which is the same as Berta Cáceres. But it took us years of going to El Salvador before they would tell us they were indigenous because it wasn't their secret, but they're so used to being diminished and marginalized and killed in El Salvador for being indigenous. So I don't know how you separate it for most of it because they're against mining largely because they want to save their water and land. And one can't really diminish that. And you economists out there, well, what the mining companies do is they come in and they say, we're green mining, we're green miners, we're responsible mining. The company Oceana Gold, it's now owned by Oceana Gold, it's not a name you probably know, but it's one of the big mining companies. When they came into El Salvador, tried to come in, they said, we have this wonderful mine in the northern Philippines that is green mining. It's wonderful. It was, I don't know if it was serendipity or fate, but John and I had been there. And we actually brought, this group we helped co-found called International Allies of La Mesa, brought the governor from that province in the Philippines to El Salvador. And it just, again, serendipity or fate, it happened to be the week that the legislature in El Salvador was voting on mining. We didn't plan it that way. It just took a long time to get a visa. So he was able to testify, to bear witness to what mining, what green and responsible mining looked like. But that mining company was saying that they were going to bring 36,000 jobs to El Salvador. 36,000 jobs is a lot of jobs. This is where, thank you, Jerry, for teaching me economics or whatever it was. So, the company, the government, all the pro-mining people were saying 36,000 jobs. How can we say no to this? This is our future. If you actually read the report, the most labor-intensive part of that mining project was 450 jobs that would be created during construction. The mine would exist for 7 years, but in the report, the multiplier effect runs wild. One mine becomes 3 mines. You don't have brothels, but you have hotels and you have resorts and you have, and suddenly there's 36,000 jobs. So one has to be, and they've done this every country we've been involved with. I don't know Ecuador, but I thought it's the same. They promise all these jobs. So what people are doing, and do you want me to stop there and you take it from there?
Sure.
Okay.
Sure.
So now I'll turn it to John, over to John.
Okay, thank you. And by the way, this whole conversation is about persistence in the struggle for justice. And I did just want to note, while we were speaking, another colleague from IPS came in, Chuck Collins, who a couple decades ago banded with some of you to try to get a millionaire's tax passed in Massachusetts.
Good job, John.
Yeah, he failed. He learned from the mistake. He and others of you pushed, and you passed a millionaire's tax in Massachusetts. And just congratulations to all of you and to Chuck back there. But yes, back to this question. First, I am fascinated by the question of who the water defenders are, and Manuela, rooting it in indigenous communities. IPS does a lot of work with a group here in the US called the Poor People's Campaign. And 5 years ago, they did a tour across the US, and they asked poor people in this country what the #1 environmental issue was. And the #2 environmental issue was climate, but the #1 environmental issue was water. So from the people in Flint who had contaminated water, to the people in Alabama who had raw sewage pouring on their yards, to the Apache in Arizona who were fighting against a giant copper mine. And so they became water defenders, and they made defense of water a centerpiece of their work. And it's interesting, Manuela, you mentioned that Boric and Petro don't start as water defenders. Neither did Bernie Sanders or Joe Biden, but these movements pressed them. And then you got Bernie going to rural areas in South Carolina, to be with people whose water pipes are deteriorating. And Joe Biden then helped pass a bill that has $55 billion for water infrastructure. So clearly, it starts in those communities, and that's how we'll win. But 2 other quick things. I mean, what do you think is the most prosperous and equal country in Central America? It is the country that decided to keep it in the ground, and that is Costa Rica. And instead, you were alluding to this, Manuel. I mean, instead built their economy around ecotourism and a consciousness about inequality. So there are many alternatives. And then finally, you're right. So we're in this crazy moment now where nations in the world are agreeing to a massive transition from fossil fuels to something else. But as you point out, they're doing it slowly with the US and Russia being the laggards. But that's the catchword, this green transition. And it turns out it is based, as people have mentioned, on 6 in particular minerals: lithium, cobalt, manganese, copper, and so on. And as Manuela has said, there's no way to mine them safely. Lithium in particular uses massive amounts of water. So what are we going to do? Are we against the green transition? Are we for keeping everything in the ground? We were helped a bunch by a wonderful ecologist at the hated World Bank, Robert Goodland, who did, so there were like 3 good people in the World Bank. I mean, there probably more, but he came up with a concept of no-go zones. He said there are 6 or 7 categories where you should never mine. So areas of biodiversity, areas on indigenous lands, so on. Going through the 7, he concluded that El Salvador, you could have no mining. But clearly, the transition will take time. If you asked us, are we for ending all mining tomorrow? I mean, that'd be an interesting question. But realistically, it's not going to happen. But if you could restrict mining to the areas that are not those fragile zones that we've described, it'd be a step in the right direction. And finally, let me just say, you could do a lot of that in this country. We recycle about 30% of the metals we use in this country. We throw the other 70% away. It's ridiculous. If we recycled 90% of it, you could cut our mining demand in half. So doing that, and then finally making sure that, Robin always points this out, if people who have 3 gas guzzling cars shift them to 3 electric cars with big lithium batteries, there's still going to be massive destruction. So there's a great movement in this country, learning from Europe, learning from others, to shift investment in infrastructure towards public transit so that we reduce dependence on cars is another key portion of this. So it will take massive efforts in the rich countries and the poor countries, but it's got to be around a common vision that is rooted, starts with communities on the ground, indigenous communities at the center, but communities on the ground and building from there out.
Thank you. I think we have maybe time for one more round of questions. We've got about 10 minutes left. Anybody from the Zoom world? Kira. Oh, sorry.
Hi, my name is Paulina Ortiz. I am covering the story for student newspaper, but I was also born and raised in Guatemala. So very different from what we learn usually in Guatemala, which is still very much rooted in neoliberalism. So my question is, what does the future look like for Latin American countries, both countries like El Salvador who have started to make these changes, and for countries who haven't, like Guatemala and Argentina, who are still like very much rooted in the neoliberalist economy that was based on pretty much every single Latin American country from the beginning?
Hi, good evening. This is Juan Camilo Cárdenas. I am I'm a faculty here at the economics department, and I want to thank you about all these remarks and looking forward to read the book. And the question in a way relates to mentioning Costa Rica and of course El Salvador. And I want to ask you, to what extent those 2 cases may give us some clues that when you have countries with very low natural endowments of minerals, then they can go ahead with this kind of trends. I don't think this is about left or right. We have seen everything happening in the whole spectrum. But then you switch to Bolivia, huge endowment, indigenous movement, cocaleros, and then this wasn't a big case for water defenders bringing their ideas all the way to the top. So to me, the challenge is when you have high endowment, high metal endowment mostly, but also fossil fuels, then it's going to be problematic. And I am seeing it right now with Francia Marquez in Colombia. I am a bit pessimistic right now, because I don't think at this point, which is interesting, the Minister of Mining and Environment comes from Francia. It's the only minister that she has actually been able to put in the cabinet, the only one.
Sorry, she comes from what?
From Francia Marquez.
Okay, sorry.
She's very close to Francia. And sadly, she started in the cabinet, her government, she started with the idea to stop further exploration and definitely extraction of fossil fuels. And she's now unable to succeed in that. And the Minister of Finance is winning. And that says high endowment countries are going to have a tough time on this. Having said that, I am totally in agreement with Manuela that this has to come from the bottom up, and we have plenty of stories. And this is definitely one of those coming from the bottom up, but there's going to be a ceiling, a glass ceiling. And I think one of the reasons for the glass ceiling is the endowment, the natural endowment. Chile is the other case. Peru is another case. You have high endowment of metals because of the geology, and then this is going to get stopped at some point. But provinces and communities are achieving things at the local level, and that gives us hope. The last piece of hope is the following: 80% of the population in Latin America lives in the cities. 80%. So water is going to be the key negotiating part. The water defenders can sit on the table and talk to 80% of the population and say, you want to live whatever style of life you want in the cities, but you need water. So how are we going to deal with this? But it's like sour and sad and sweet at the same time, seeing all these conflicting issues in Latin America. So I wanted to hear your reactions about that, and particularly the problem of natural endowments of the countries.
Karen, did you want to have a last question?
Well, I guess I want to open a can of worms, sort of, and pick up the question about what does it mean that 50% of indigenous people are doing the protesting, but push for a different kind of exploration of that question, in the sense that it's not about mining per se, right? There's no good mining. It's not about jobs either. It's a very different kind of economy. It's a different kind of sovereignty. You're talking about land. So we're opening up bigger questions. And so back, lobbing that question back, and specifically to Manuela, and of course we'll have these discussions at other times, but it's not about production it's not about capitalist production, right? And every time these days, increasingly, I'm surprised by how short the discussion about social reproduction was. Because back to the issue of why is it that 50% of water defenders are fighting for all our needs, right? And one way to make the connection in a very quotidian and popular way is think about Roman Polanski's film that I'm suddenly losing, the one about California and water in California. Chinatown. Part about the film that one doesn't think about, but I think it's a crux, is the issue of domestic violence, right? So again, I'm making this roundabout way of, it's about social reproduction, a different kind of social reproduction that's completely invisible, that's being drawn upon again and again and again and again. So I'm lobbing back that question, and yeah.
Okay, that's going to have to be the last round of questions, because we are in fact close to being out of time. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
One more.
Okay, we'll take one more quick question if we can, but we're down to our last 3 minutes here. So go ahead.
Oh, the mic, yeah.
Sorry.
All right, thank you. I'm Tendai from Zimbabwe, Africa. All right.
I can see you.
Okay. All right. It seems as if the buzzword is indigenous people taking up arms against any company, whatever. But if you also have research interests in regions whereby there's so much repressions, whereby people cannot have a voice, indigenous people do not have a voice. If you check in most African countries, you see that most of these companies, they go to bed with governments, politicians, such that at the end of the day, the indigenous people do not have a voice. What are your recommendations concerning those issues? Because you see in Latin America, people are standing up to that, but there are many countries around the globe where people cannot say anything concerning environmental issues, water issues, and so on and so forth. Do we have to wait for the indigenous reprisals? Or there are certain mechanisms to make sure that water issues and everything is solved? Thank you.
Okay. Again, let's decide how
It's about producing self-determination and consent. And it's not a coincidence that Latin America has the highest level of extraction in the world, right? Commodities export and the highest levels of femicide in the world. It goes hand in hand. The appropriation of nature is the appropriation of women. It's about the reproduction of life and lifeways and the sucking up of sovereignty and self-determination. I forgot another point, but it's the state will not be able to stop it. Whoever was maybe one. We see time and again that local government is starting to ally with the water defenders as a political strategy, or just because they're being invaded and there's no more water and they're like they can't feed the town. But what we see is that the national governments are being pressured and squeezed, and there's no other way. The national government, the state, since Potosi, finances itself through extraction, right? Since Potosi until today, whether it's mine, oil, agribusiness in Brazil. Lula promised no extraction, but allied with Simon, the agribusiness candidate. So, of course, he will continue extraction. We're hoping that some territories will be protected, but there is no way out without pressure coming from below.
Great. Yeah, but first of all, thank you for all these beautiful questions, and looking forward to chatting with you a little bit more when we finish. To the question of what you do in the countries like Guatemala or Argentina, well, just hang out with Manuela, because she's from one of them, Ecuador. And but the one thing I'll just say, Guatemala, that gave us hope. In July, we went to El Salvador to be with people, and they brought us up to the northern border with Guatemala and brought us across this lake that is shared between the two countries. So we went into Guatemala, and we were there because there's a mine in southern Guatemala that is at the, and then it goes into the lake, and the lake goes into the Lempa River. So this mine has to be stopped. They just had an amazing process of doing a consultation, a referendum in that town, and 80% of the people voted against mining. Now they're in a big fight with the federal government over what that means. But as Juan said, that's where the action is. My final thing, I want to make a plea. It's interesting for, yes, it is largely going to be fights that start from below. And yes, you sometimes then win local governments, or in the case of Argentina, 7 provinces forced, the governors didn't want to do this, forced from below to ban mining. But I want us to also throw maybe 10% of our energy into really trying to force some of these presidents into becoming water defenders. I mean, they become more popular by becoming water defenders. And I just want to say, I bet not one person in this room, their first choice for president of the United States was Joe Biden. But I just want a big shout out. Bernie Sanders, before he left that race, he said, my people will not come to you, Joe Biden, unless it's real. It's not going to be real unless you embrace our issues. We're going to do 6 task forces on the key issues. I'm going to put my people on it. You put your people on it. Turns out Biden's people had no ideas. Bernie's people full of ideas. It was Pramila Jayapal and AOC and other leaders. And they gave an agenda that included the care economy, that included healthcare for all, that included many of the things that Joe Biden then ran on, knowing he wouldn't win if he didn't get the Bernie and Warren supporters. And then he governed on them in the first year. And so I don't want us to get, I agree. So Boric, Lula, Gustavo Petro, Francia Marquez. I mean, thank God there's Francia Marquez, but to make it, movements need to make it so that they feel that it is in their interest to be water defenders. And when we do that, they win. They have the power at that level. And I think we will, if we're back here 5 years from now and we've moved one of them to ban some kind of mining or to, it will have been an effort well spent. And I think that's part of why this could be a blue tide or a green tide at a higher level in Latin America than it's been in the past. Thank you.
So I'm the wrap up of all the loose ends or the garbage or whatever. So just a few key points. So I was going to talk about Guatemala, but I won't, because John already talked about that. The Argentina for a minute, we've been saying that 7 out of 21 provinces have banned mining or banned the use of a chemical like cyanide, which you can't mine without. But examples of 2 of them. One is Mendoza. And if you don't buy your wine from Chile, buy it from Mendoza, Argentina, because the water defenders in Mendoza, Argentina include the winemakers. You can't make wine without water. That's the unlikely allies. Second, another province in Argentina, Chubut. Chubut has had a ban on mining 4 times. People were asking, we're talking about the power struggle. 4 times the governor of Chubut tried to overturn that ban. In December, he actually got the provincial legislature, the provincial Congress, to overturn that ban. Immediately, people took to the street. Not just the indigenous people, not religious people, but just people who use water. That's precisely the 80% of people living in the cities, be they big cities or little cities. That's who's going to join in the street. And amazingly enough, the legislature and in Argentina, the president came to to Chubut to say we need mining. They went back, they rolled it back, and a ban exists again. It's El Salvador, it's not going to be just we get a ban and the ban stays. It's a power struggle. And it's the more water is understood as the issue, water and land, but the more those concentric circles reach out. Final point, because I know Jim's looking at his watch, is our book deals or whoever's watch, phone, whatever one looks at these days. Our book deals so for we couldn't, when we and people on the ground in El Salvador decided that a book needed to be written, we had one major problem, that we needed the voice of mining companies, that we couldn't write a book, or we felt we couldn't write a book without trying to also be somewhat honest to how the mining companies approach this. My father was a metallurgical engineer. I learned a lot about metals from talking to him, but miners aren't, these miners, people, the people who go out and find gold and silver, they're kind of a really interesting people. They plop themselves down in the rural areas and they smell and look and whatever, and they see the mining. So the minerals, we got really lucky and ended up with 2 troves of documents from internal documents from the mining company. The miners wouldn't talk to us. In the Philippines, they say they will let anyone, anyone who wants can tour their plant, their operations. they said no to us and we gave them a 2-week period, but they somehow had meetings every moment of that 2-week period. But so we got one set of documents from this case at the World Bank, which the Salvadoran government made public. And then it's a longer, I won't tell you, another trove of documents, a research assistant of mine who was doing research in El Salvador. It's a better, longer story than I'm going to tell. But anyways, she ended up at dinner with and a family, and the man said, oh, you're working on mining? I have this, I was the head of a company that tried to mine here. And I've been keeping a box of all these documents from all our meetings with the government and with other mining companies. And I don't know, God must have, he said something like, God must have wanted me to save them to share them with you. So we got the voices of the mining companies, and part of our book is really dealing with these two very different concepts of progress. And so we couldn't have a kind of conversation we're having here. I mean, basically, you put the people from the water defenders of Cavanagh in the same room as the would-be mining, the executives, and they couldn't have a conversation because they were talking about very different things. And let me find, and one of the CEOs said, I'm wrapping it up, but one of the CEOs on a Canadian broadcast, most of these corporations are Canadian or Australian now. But she said she was being interviewed about what was going on in El Salvador after the murders. And she said, these are rice. I mean, rice is the Philippines. These are corn and bean farmers. They can't possibly be against mining. And then she goes on to say, it has to be rogue NGOs. It's a great term, rogue NGOs who are bringing them lies. And I think she was being really serious. In her mind, she could not imagine how indigenous populations, how Marcelo, Miguel, and Vitalina, how they could possibly just simply want their children to be able to farm the land and hopefully be a little better off than they are. And that's a lot what it went at in reaching out. It makes it really hard to reach out to those people unless one is respectful of how they're thinking. I don't know how you change those minds, but the good news is that the water defenders are on the rise, I think, because water is so important. As the water defenders say, water is life. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all three speakers, Robin, John, Manuela. And let me just conclude by saying one of the difficulties of that lack of communication that Robin was referring to and of building the broad alliances that we've talked about all evening is people don't know, there's a huge lack of contact and information because people live in their own little worlds and they don't often get a glimpse of the other ones. And so I not only would urge all of you to get those glimpses if and when you can, but also buy the book. You got it. I was thinking up to that. Yeah, the book is like a little window that opens up and shows you a world that otherwise you might not know exists, but it's as much there as we are here. So thank you again. Thank you all for coming. It sounds like from John's comment that they are willing to sit around for a few more minutes.